Good afternoon, everyone. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and today I'm going to do an updated random access memory video. Okay, a long time ago, about 13 years ago, I did a video about random access memory, and I'm going to update you guys on random access memory. Now, this is not to be confused with read-only memory, which was used back in the day to help boot up your computer. It was actually, the information was actually etched onto the chip, so that when it activated, that would be the first thing that would pop up on your screen, so that the computer could actually interface with all of its various components and that kind of stuff. Okay, that was, and I will give an updated video about read-only memory on a future date, but I'm not going to cover it right now. Today's video is about random access memory, and before I go ahead and cover this, I wanted to let you know that I have 5 Kindle books, and if you're interested in buying any of them, let me know down here in the comments below, and I'll send you links to those. Okay? So let's briefly talk about random access memory. This was a big thing back when I was young. Computers still have random access memory today, but the thing about random access memory is that when a computer is turned off, everything stored in that random access memory just disappears. It's not like a hard drive or a floppy drive or, you know, these little flash cards or thumb drives, that kind of stuff, where stuff is stored for a lot longer. The thing is that in those days, you turned off the random access memory, that was it. So you had to physically remember. Of course, back in those days, they didn't exactly have hard drives. You got to keep in mind, I grew up in the latter part of the 1970s and the early 1980s. So when we finally got our computers, we had to literally remember, if we wanted that information stored, we had to actually store it on the disk before we turned off the computer. Because if we didn't, it was gone. Okay, that's one thing about, that's why it's called, that's part of the reason why it's called random access memory. The other reason why it's called random access memory is because, unlike read-only memory, okay, or say a hard drive or something like that, when you have a hard drive or cassette tapes or anything of that kind of media, what happens is you have to go all the way through the hard drive to find the information. In other words, information is stored in a specific spot on a hard drive or on a disk. Okay? And you have to go through the whole disk to find that information. You have to literally search for it. With random access memory, it's set up in such a way that you can find the information rather easily. You don't have to go through the whole hard drive or the whole disk or anything like that. You don't have to do that. Okay? Alright. So, random access memory, or RAM, is basically short-term memory. Okay? And it, like I said, it stores that information until your computer shuts down. Then that information is erased. RAM memory chips are really integrated circuit boards. That's what they are. These integrated circuit boards contain thousands of transistors and capacitors. The capacitors store something called electrons. And this is where we get into a discussion of bit and byte. Okay? So what happens is that these capacitors, they store electrons. And if there are electrons in the capacitor, that makes up a bit. Okay? And it's sort of like an on-off switch. When you turn that switch on, then you have electricity present. If you turn it off, you don't have any electricity present. That's the way it works. Okay? And, of course, nowadays, they don't just have thousands of capacitors on the chips. They have millions. And the way that actually works is that these capacitors, in their own way, are etched onto the integrated circuit board. Okay? In the old days, there was actually a physical capacitor. You attached it with a soldering iron. Nowadays, those capacitors are so tiny that they can literally be etched on the circuit board. That's how that works. Okay? So, if the electrons are stored inside the capacitor, we know that there is 1 bit stored in the capacitor. These capacitors are paired with transistors. Why? Because transistors, they sort of like, you remember those old-time castles where you would have armed soldiers standing at the gates? Well, same basic principle. they allow the CPU to see the information on the capacitor. Okay, so the CPU actually detects whether there are electrons on the capacitor or not. And this is how it reads random access, how it reads bits and bytes. Okay, and if the CPU decides to delete the information on the random access memory, it tells the transistor delete it, release the electrons from the capacitor. Okay. Now, the CPU can actually tell the transistor to actually put electrons on the capacitor, or the CPU can tell the transistor to take electrons away from the capacitor. Okay, that's how that works. And that is basically how random access memory works. Now, I could go into greater detail about that, and I will in a future video. But in the meantime, now you have a basic understanding of how random access memory works. And we will go into further details on this, like I said, in a future video. I want to thank you for watching this particular presentation. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.